Lotus Spree is unparalleled.
It's just a British supercar, and there aren't many of them around.
Everybody else has tried to copy it. It is the ultimate supercar at the end of the day.
It's bedroom wall poster stuff. The shape's an absolute icon.
The looks are just so dramatic, they're so stunning. Even when it's stationary by the side of the road, it looks like it's moving.
It's a classic supercar shape.
A fantastic piece of British engineering, a real achievement.
You can buy a Lamborghini, you can buy a Ferrari. They all look like the Esprit.
Well, the story of the Esprit can probably be traced back as far as 1972, when the Italian stylist Giorgetto Giugiaro approached Colin Chapman to supply a car for display on his stand at the Turin Motor Show. That particular car was actually based on a Europa chassis, but gave probably the first sort of public airing to what would become the Esprit shape. The vehicle was very well received at that particular show, so Lotus decided that it should sort of go into production. The design shape was recognisable immediately as an Esprit, very wedge-shaped, and even flatter windscreen profile than would eventually sort of come through into production. But already the foundations were there, if you like, for the production car. But it was, however, quite some time between that first initial showing in 1972 and the running prototype, which didn't actually get seen until 1975, some 3 years later. I mean, even by this stage in Lotus's life, it had become a bit of a tradition to start all of the road cars with the letter E, of course, with the Elite of the early 60s, followed by, of course, the Elan and the Europa. So I think it was inevitable that the Esprit would end up with a name beginning with an E, although, of course, initially it was to be called the Kiwi, in recognition of the fact that it had a very long, pointy nose.
Series 1 is a classic in its own right. I mean, it's just a shape, it's just the very first start of the mark. If you had no idea what a Lotus Esprit was, in particular a Series 1, it's just a British supercar, and there aren't many of them around. It was tapping into the designs of the 70s, which they are classic swooping wedge cutting edge shapes, and they are still around together, and every schoolboy loves it today, and men of our age between 30 and 40 will continue to fall in love with that car.
The Esprit, when it was first seen by the motoring press, was considered to be quite groundbreaking. I think it was possibly the first time that an English manufacturer had made a car that perhaps could rival the Italians in terms of outrageous styling. I think it's fair to say, though, that first driving impressions were perhaps a little bit short of the mark. Lotus's claims for acceleration times and top speed were perhaps a little bit ambitious, and the first cars probably didn't quite meet up to those expectations.
When the actual magazine journalist got hold of it, it didn't really deliver. It was knocking more like 125, and it wasn't reaching 6 seconds. It was more like nudging 7 seconds before it hit 60 miles an hour. But fair enough for a car which in those days wasn't that expensive. Okay, it had gone up more than originally quoted at the motor show in 1972. It's, you know, a lot cheaper than a Ferrari.
I think it's true to say that the early cars, when delivered to their owners, were probably a little bit underdeveloped. Lotus, no doubt, had put a lot of effort into the ride and handling characteristics of the car, which is, of course, synonymous with any Lotus road car. But in terms of the detail finish, I think a lot of the early owners would have perhaps felt that they were just finishing off the development stage of the vehicle, which perhaps Lotus should have done before launch to the public.
In true Lotus tradition, they were a little bit unreliable for the first few owners as well. It was commonly known that the first purchasers, the first drivers, were actually unofficially test pilots, because they were bringing them back, breaking down and saying, this thing's wrong with it. Oh, right, well, we'll fix it. One thing in particular was cooling. They were overheating like the previous Lotuses, and they only had a certain type of fan on the radiator, which they later modded with Series 2s and Series 3s. But even that, other owners have done modifications in the engine bay, mounting separate fans to keep it cool, especially on tick-over when you're stuck in a motorway jam. Well, my car is one of the first ones off the production line from 1976. As you can see, it's been recently restored, not bad by myself, regrettably. Fully resprayed, full new leather interior. Now, they weren't putting leather interiors in the 70s, it was like a check green tartan colour in those days, which some might say makes it more authentic, but I never particularly liked that. From the 70s, it was a true kit car, and they've been tapping into other people's parts bins in effect, and you will recognise sat behind the steering wheel switch gear from British Leyland, handles off a Morris Marina, outside typical ones that were on Range Rovers and around that time. The rear light clusters, here's an anorak one for you, is off a Fiat X19, along with the motors which power the front headlamps, which make them pop up and down. When you get inside of it, it is so retro. There are huge switches, huge steering wheel, everything's very manual, very easy to fix, none of this electronic stuff, it's huge carburettors, very small engine which has been over-modified from various other derivatives, which Lotus are always good at doing, but it's a great car. Personally, I think the best thing about being the Lotus owner is that you are practically involved. I enjoy tinkering. It is a car that needs pampering. Do not think you can jump in it and drive it like your Nissan Micra or any other Japanese box that will start every time until a battery eventually packs in. You have to be thinking, why is that temperature gauge packed in? Why is that handbrake? Why is that throttle jamming open? You've got to be just thinking your way through the mechanical bits. Having waited an awful long time for a Lotus Esprit, in particular a Series 1, they are very difficult to come across on the second-hand market, so I did wait a long time for a Series 1, and eventually I found the one behind me. It was being sold privately, and the guy that was selling it was very adamant about the price, so we did talk quite a lot about things that weren't quite right. But then I went for a spin, and it was the deciding factor. He took me around an industrial estate, he showed me what it really could do. I had a go. Once I worked out fickle gear change, which, as most Esprit owners know, it can be a bit tricky at times. It's, quite frankly, the fastest car I've ever driven for a long time. Living where I live, which is somewhat green belt, you just do not see this kind of car. You might see exotic cars in city centres, you might see Ferraris or the nice Cheshire Shep, which in the northwest with the footballers, but a classic supercar style like it is behind me, it is, people do sort of give me it's every day, they look sideways and follow me as I drive down the road, which is quite nice as a driver. But when I drive my other car, which is a van, you expect people to continue to look at you that way, and they don't. Well, one of the better things about owning a classic British supercar like I have in the 70s is that you can source the parts from other cars. I do enjoy going around scrapyards, I do enjoy finding a starter motor which is technically speaking off another car altogether. One of the bad things about owning a Lotus Esprit, it was really designed around Colin Chapman, who I think was not 6 foot tall. I think he was a little bit under, and being 6'4", it is tricky. I have got a bit of a bad back at a young age.
The Lotus Spree, of course, received worldwide acclaim as the James Bond car with Roger Moore in The Spy Who Loved Me. We still get asked today whether that particular car was actually capable of going underwater, which of course it wasn't.
This is the James Bond car. This is like, I've been waiting a long time. I wanted this car since I was 6. I wasn't going to make do with a red one or a yellow one. It had to be white. It had to be the spec of the Bond car. The fact it didn't have the original interior doesn't really bother me. I am so happy with this car.
I think the benefit to Esprit of starring in a James Bond film was incalculable. Right to the end of production in 2004, I still have customers aspiring to own an Esprit because they first saw its son nearly 30 years previous in the James Bond movie.
Well, the ultimate one to have was white because of the Bond car, but I saw the red one look good in red as well, and fairly unique. There aren't many about. There were a fair few white ones at the time. The Esprit was always the one I wanted, and eventually I could afford it, so out I went and had it ever since. They're fun cars. In my opinion, the ultimate driving experience. You feel part of the car. It's like a road go-kart. I feel proud to own it. It's very rare now, and people still show a lot of interest in them. People do turn eyes when they see it go by. The number plate's pretty unique, so I get comments. But yes, 25 years on, it's still an eye-turner.
The thing about the S1 is it's pure. It's the way it was designed. I mean, there's very little from the silver car, which was shown in Turin in 1972. There's very few changes. It's just beautiful, and it'll turn as many heads now as all the souped-up V8s. It is the Esprit.
The launch of the Series 2 in 1978 probably saw a more complete Esprit, with a lot of the early problems being taken care of.
The S2 is a very small upgrade, mostly due to cooling. They did a lot of work to get more air into the engine because they were having a lot of overheating problems on the S1.
I think the customer development that maybe occurred with the Series 1 was now complete, and the car was probably a sort of more finished article.
My car's a 1979 Series 2 Esprit, pretty standard. I bought it in '97. And I was fortunately the 13th owner in 18 years, so unlucky for some, but pretty lucky for me, I think. Well, the Series 2 came about with various modifications, improvements on the Series 1 really. Underneath it's pretty much exactly the same. From the outside you can see the wraparound front spoiler, which gave the car a bit more stability at higher speeds. Also fed air onto the radiator a little more efficiently to keep the cooling sorted, which was one of the major problems with the Series 1. The other cooling aspect, you can see sort of 2/3 of the way down the car, little ears behind the rear quarter light windows. One channeled cold air into the carburetors, which made it run a bit better, and the other one circulated cool air in the engine bays. It's not a fast car by modern day standards, even though it looks like it should go pretty quickly. But the redeeming feature is the handling, pure and simple. It's an absolute joy to drive. It's like driving a go-kart, but quite a big and very good-looking go-kart.
I think the Series 2 Esprit is synonymous with the limited edition JPS model, which was launched in commemoration of Mario Andretti winning the World Championship in that year.
Lotus was one of the first companies to use marketing to push the car, which was basically an S2, but it was colour-coded to the Formula 1 cars, and there was little reefs on the side saying World Champions, had gold wheels and a different interior, basically as a marketing ploy to push the S2 and to give somebody something different to buy.
Well, this car is one of the limited edition John Player Special Esprits. They were produced in 1979. The basic difference is, beyond the external trim that you see, is an internal trim package, and they were given a plaque signed by Chapman to say that they were a limited edition motor car. Presumably they've got lots of scribes somewhere signing them all off. Lotus produced 95 of them. We've got about 40 on the register in the UK and about 35 in America. Like all clubs, the intention is to try and swap parts and keep things going. With a Lotus, that's an important part of owning a Lotus.
The Series 2 really did have supercar appearance, but really still lacked something in the performance department. But I think that was soon to change. '80 saw the introduction of the Esprit Turbo, which offered a massive increase in terms of power, up to 210 brake horsepower from 160 brake horsepower. The same year, of course, saw a change of sponsorship for Lotus in Formula 1 with Essex Petroleum. The first 100 cars were all painted in Essex corporate colours of blue, silver and red.
There was a big release at the Royal Albert Hall. I think Shirley Bassey was singing, and I think the Formula 1 cars come out, and the Esprit Essex Turbo, which was now, you know, the Esprit with supercar performance.
The car behind me, it's the Esprit Turbo Essex pre-production prototype. Very first turbo car ever built by Lotus. It was used in a lot of test beds. The turbo which was fitted to it originally was removed, and it was used as a test bed for the V8. It was also the show car at the 1980 London Motor Show. It was used by Champion spark plugs as a test bed for the new type of spark plug they were developing. It was used to test BBS alloys. It was also used in conjunction with the James Bond film For Your Eyes Only through Pinewood Studios. When they brought the turbo model out, obviously it's got different body parts to it. It's got the side skirts in it with the ducts for the rear brakes. It's got the heavy downforce rear spoiler. It's also got the lower front skirt. These all add to the handling and the performance of the car. The story is that Colin Chapman actually went out and bought a helicopter for himself. While it was being worked on, he noticed the turbo on the engine and thought, right, I'm going to take that off there. I'm going to put it on one of my engines. It was when the 2.2 engine was being produced, so he bolted the turbo on, and that's where the turbo came from, apparently. The Esprit has always been a supercar. when it was first initiated in the early 70s with the 2-litre engine, it was always fast compared to other cars on the road, which is why Lotus got the name. But when they put the turbo on it, what a difference. I mean, all you have to do is look at the specs of them, the 0 to 60, the performance, the overall speed and the handling as well. The turbo is a much better car than the earlier ones.
Lotus decided not to pursue the V8 route at this particular time in the car's history because in certain countries, particularly mainland Europe, there was in place a luxury tax which is based on cubic capacity of engines. So by going the turbocharged route rather than the larger V8 route, they were able to offer the performance that the vehicle deserved without perhaps the monetary penalty that was in place in some countries.
The car was built with a V8 engine in it. It was a test bed, but the engine was not successful at all. They kept blowing them up, and the actual last engine what was fitted to the car is in the foyer of Lotus Cars at Hethel. It's actually cross-sectioned, so you can actually see all the workings inside of it.
The Esprit story, of course, continued with a second appearance in a James Bond film, For Your Eyes Only, with Roger Moore in 1980, with the turbocharged version and, of course, fitted with the ski racks. Again, even to this day, we're asked by people whether they can have ski racks. Of course, they never actually appeared on the options list.
When Pinewood Studios came to Lotus Cars UK asking for another car, they wanted another Esprit like the white one that was used in the underwater shots in the earlier Bond film, but they wanted something a different colour to stand out in the snows of Cortina. So Lotus showed them our car, which was blue with red interior at the time. Pinewood said, no, that's no good for us. So Lotus came up with the copper colour, which this car is painted in, to stand out from the snow. So this was actually a standing car in the film, from what I've been told. It was never driven by any of the Bond characters such as Roger Moore, who was in the film, but it was actually in shot for around about 3 seconds. The acceleration on the car is absolutely phenomenal. It's still as it should be, not 60 and 5.5. We had it on a racetrack and we have had it up to 155 mile an hour on the straight, which is what you'd expect from it. Handling, tricky in the wet, as they always have been, but in the dry, it's like it's on rails. It's brilliant. As to the history of the Esprit, the importance of this car really, I think, does stand out with it being the first turbo car ever built by Lotus. In the early 80s, it had quite a bit of press coverage in magazines, books, newspapers because of what they used the car for. But I think the most significant importance of the car is its link to the James Bond film. The car's owned by a hotel in Saltburn, which is in Cleveland. I take the car around to car shows, I drive it round, we use it for weddings, for driving best man, groom. Driving around the streets, everybody turns their head, what was that, what was that? And little dogs just jump into hedges and stuff because of the noise, because it's so loud. The car's used as a wedding car for best man and groom usually, due to the fact that people class it as a Bond car because it was built in conjunction with the Bond film For Your Eyes Only. A few years ago, I wasn't driving it myself, one of the other employees was driving it, and she was driving a best man to one of the weddings at the hotel, and she was going at some speed down a dual carriageway. When she arrived back at the hotel, the gentleman asked her what she'd done for a living. She said, oh, I'm a receptionist, but I also drive the cars for weddings sometimes. And the guy turned around and said, oh, by the way, I'm a traffic cop, don't let me see you do that again. As to the value of the car, it's actually insured as irreplaceable because of what it is, with it being the pre-production prototype. If anything happened to it, we cannot replace it.
I first saw the Lotus Spree in the James Bond film Spy Love Me, and it was that car chase and coming out the water, etc. That really did it for me.
I fell in love with it in 1972 or 73 when the first Series 1 came out, and I thought, it's got to be a Lotus Esprit.
This is a 1985 Lotus Esprit Turbo. I've had it 8 years now, and basically it's a car of my dreams. It's probably one of the most gorgeous looking cars ever, and for what the car is, it makes you look a fantastic driver no matter what level of driving skills you have, which I've found on many occasions when I've gone into a corner just a little bit too fast and come out looking very good indeed.
Because an 85 Esprit Turbo, I bought it 10 years ago. She's done 110,000 miles on the same engine. She's still pulling a 65 pound oil pressure at 3,000 revs. To sell it, no, there's not enough money in the world to buy that particular car off me, because I love it so much.
The engine's a 2.2 turbo, kicking out 210 brake horsepower, and it's good for about 5.5 to 6 seconds 0 to 60. I haven't tried the 150 mile an hour top end yet though. When I drive the car, even after I've had a long weekend fixing a problem with it, I'll take it out for that drive and it just put a great big smile on my face, regardless of what's happened or what money I've just thrown at it.
An Esprit, well, I think myself on the road, there's nothing to catch them or look like them or smell like them. And it's just a head turner. We're driving through Bastogne in Belgium, doing 10 mile an hour, and was going past cafes on the side of the road and people were shouting James Bond's car. And it was the feeling, I can't explain it, it's just out of this world. And it just melts you.
My Esprit's 1986 model. It had one previous owner apart from myself. It was stored for 10 years, in which it covered only about 100 or so miles. Unfortunately though, it was stored in a carport, so the sun sort of shone on it for half the year and wrecked all the leather on one side, wrecked all the paintwork down one side. So the person that I bought it off, he actually restores the cars, so he had it all re-leathered and resprayed, and he's done a pretty good job. Ever since I was small, I've always liked the wedge shape. You could try and sell me some of the other Esprits that we have here today, but for me it's really got to be the sort of hard-edged corners that just seem to draw me to the vehicle. Yeah, the other ones are nice, but you know, you've got to worship the wedge.
This is the epitome of the Esprit to me, because obviously it is the final development of the original Giugiaro shape. That car is totally standard. There's very few modifications whatsoever done to it, so it is pretty well bog standard as we expect from the factory as it left the factory, which is how I'd like to keep it. Even down to original NCT Goodyear tyres at the moment, they're nearly out, so they've got to change soon. Tyres are becoming a problem. But no, it's done 60-odd thousand miles. It's excellent, doesn't smoke, doesn't cause any problems. It's had one engine rebuild apparently in its life, but it's got all the performance that should be there, and I'm very pleased with it. The spec on this car is basically a standard engine, but it's turboed, of course, which came with that particular model. There's a glass sunroof to it. Colour of my car, epitome of British sports cars, I suppose. Red, it's got to be red. Fantastic Magnolia full leather interior to it, which is in exceptionally good condition. It's been recolonised, which I did myself, which is very easy to do anyway, but it's certainly made a superb interior of it. As far as the actual style and line of the car, there is not a line that is wrong on that car. The Giugiaro is a brutal but dramatic shape that could only be that car. It was only from the 70s, and it'll probably never come back again. The wedge will never come back.
1987 saw the introduction of the Peter Stevens designed X180 Esprit shape. Designed in-house by Lotus Cars, it was a natural progression from the Giugiaro shape that had stood the test of time so well between 1972 and 1987.
Peter Stevens, who went on to design the Mclaren F1, started off designing the facelift. They kept the same mechanicals, the same chassis, but basically redesigned the body and the interior. The gearbox was changed from a Citroën to a Renault unit.
Dimensionally, it was pretty well identical to the Giugiaro car, being just 1 inch longer and 1 inch wider, but its slightly softer lines probably appealed more to 1980s tastes.
Like everybody else, I saw the Bond film and the one swimming underwater and was very impressed, and that was the car. But when the Stevens shape came out, I thought they'd really moved it on considerably. I always liked the first one, but it looks really angular and old-fashioned. I think the other one is beginning to look a little bit dated. Most people with the condition of it think it's probably only 3 or 4 years old, unless they're an aficionado of the marque. Yeah, I saw it and fell in love with it, basically. It's standard 1989 2.2 Stevens Turbo, which means we're 200 bhp plus. Power to weight ratio is fantastic, 0 to 65.2, top end 165ish. Of course, I'm never ever going to go anywhere near that. Apart from that, the car is completely unmolested, never been bent as far as I know. Full service history, which included a last C service, which was £2,500. Thank God I'm not going to have one of those for quite a while. Interior spec of the car, we're looking at the top of the range here. It's not an SE, but it's got full leather interior and it's Connolly. It's got air conditioning, CD player. That's a later edition. It would have had a standard cassette. No power steering, but it's not supposed to have power steering, which is a bit of a problem in car parks. And my wife's never driven it, and I don't think she ever could, because you need muscles of steel at low speed. But you get it back at high speed because the steering is crisp, precise. It goes where you point it. Lotus rummaged through other people's parts bins when they put this together. The door handles are Marina, had an exotic machine. Stalks and switches you can see have come from other places. The dials, interestingly, have got Lotus written on them, but I bet they weren't made by Lotus. The engine, of course, is theirs. Gearbox, Renault. Not the easiest gearbox in the world to use, but you get used to it. The fly-off handbrake's an interesting aspect of the car, which you don't see on many vehicles as well. If you don't fly it off, you can't get out, basically. We all know the story about middle-aged men in red sports cars, and possibly there's some truth to that, but I've got to say, first driving experience, it stopped traffic. There was lots of scantily clad young ladies looking over because it's red, it's low, it's a Ferrari, isn't it? They don't know what it is, but they're looking for a footballer driving it, and there's some disappointment when they see a sad old git driving the thing. But all the guys know what it is, and respect. It's more rounded, it's more modern, and like I say, they've not changed the shape particularly. They've added on bits with the later models, and I think every time they add something, you know, more is less. The car, I think, got spoiled with scoops, spoilers. The rear wing is a not very pleasant addition, I think, at all. And I noticed that some people on the later cars have taken the rear wing off because it doesn't really add anything. The car's designed like this. I think that Stevens got it absolutely spot on, and the performance and the handling of the car, adding extra weight and extra bits and bobs. I mean, you're into Ford Cortina with snowplow spoiler territory, aren't you? Let's keep it pure. Everybody remembers it from the Bond films, which made a big impression again on myself in what, 77, I think it would have been. We all went down the pictures and we were all going to go out and get an Esprit that fired missiles. But the shape's an absolute icon. It's bedroom wall poster stuff, and for me, it's British. You could buy a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a little bit fickle. I know Lotuses aren't. I've got a name for being not as reliable, although I've got to say this one so far, touch wood, has been pretty spot on and never let me down. Well, I've had lots of cars over the years, Stags, midgets. I have an RX-7 as well, which is an interesting car. This thing's a bit of a pig to work on though. The first job I did was change the oil. You try getting the oil filter off. Of course, it's mid-engined, it's north to south, the oil filter's not that accessible. So I thought, okay, I can't get it off, do the old screwdriver through it trick. So you knock the screwdriver through it, and of course then you're committed because your oil's coming out, you ain't going anywhere, and if you don't get that oil filter off, you've got a big problem. So you start to force the screwdriver around and it starts chewing up the oil filter. Just started to move at the last moment before I was down to a main dealer and having it drilled out. So not the easiest car in the world to work on. Only other problems I've had with it up to now is it runs a little cool, which means the oil pressure is quite high, but I mean, some cars I've had, I would have been very grateful to have had more oil pressure and less temperature. I've been on some long runs with it, took it to Wales on a track a few weeks ago at a place called Rossniger up on Anglesey. It performed pretty well. There were some Elises and Exiges going around, and those guys were seriously crazy. So to some degree I was a moving obstacle, but on the straight line, great. Round corners, not so good. It's a supercar, it's British, and it's red.
1989 saw the introduction of the Esprit Turbo SE with 264 brake horsepower, another massive increase in power that really, I think, at last finally put the Esprit in the supercar league.
The major change was the intercooling, which Lotus called charge cooler. So basically it was one of the quickest cars in the world.
The Series 4 Lotus Esprit was first seen in 1993 and was designed as a much more sort of usable example. For example, it was the first time that powered steering had been used on the Esprit. The Series 4 car offered an opportunity for a major restyling of the X180 shape, so the whole Esprit was given a new lease of life. In 1993, Lotus were pursuing a racing program in America. The upshoot of that was a car marketed for road use called the Sport 300. The Sport 300 for road use was probably a little compromised, so 1995 saw the introduction of the S4S. The S4S brought the good features from the S4 and the good features from the Sport 300 into one central model.
This is a 95 S4S, which was basically the last of the four-cylinder cars. They were kind of a bridge between a much more comfortable road car that they built called the S4 that was just a little bit more refined than the 300 that was a track car. It's reckoned to be one of the best of the four cylinders. They're very reliable, they're very high performance. It was the later shape as well, but it had an earlier shape interior, so it's kind of this very 70s interior with this kind of very 90s shape to the car. Standard, they're about 287 brake horsepower. You can convert that up to 300 brake by changing the engine management. 0 to 60 is about 4.6, 4.7 seconds. Top speed, I think it's about 180, 182 miles an hour. It's actually limited more than anything else by the fact they're 5-speed, not 6-speed gearboxes that would theoretically give you a much higher top speed. But then how often do you need to do 185? To drive the car is amazing. It's obviously the power is unbelievable. You can really feel the turbo kick in. It gives that just great kick in the back. And it just keeps accelerating. Even more than that, on the other hand, is the handling. It really doesn't matter what you do with it. You get to a corner and it's more kind of a challenge than anything else. The brakes are pretty good. They're not quite as sharp as perhaps some people would like them, but they'll stop the car. And ultimately, most of the time, you never slow down anyway. The corners are a bit of a challenge to see how fast you can go through them. So they're fine, but the handling of the car kind of compensates for perhaps a slight lacking in the brakes. It is a little bit ostentatious, it is a little bit flash, and to be honest, that's probably part of the reason why people buy them. On the whole, though, a lot of people, even those people who just think that you buy it because it's flash, take them out for a little drive and they're normally convinced that you bought it just because of the way it feels. My first memory of Esprits, I think, same as everyone else, was from the Bond films, but they never made any great impression, and I wasn't particularly into cars. When I started looking around for a sports car, wanted a little toy, and I started looking and was at the motor show and kind of ended up looking at Esprits through some advice that was given to me there. Thought they looked pretty cool. Ended up phoning a dealer who was not that far from me, who brought around a car that he thought would be particularly appealing to me. and he brought it round to my office, and it was driving down this little Surrey High Street with the sun glinting off the white paintwork, and I was watching everyone's heads turn around and looking out the window, and I just thought, yeah, I'm buying that. I hadn't even driven it and I knew I was going to buy it. First time I ever drove the Esprit was quite interesting. The car unfortunately had a slightly faulty gearbox. So as we were trying to get out of the little town in traffic, I mean the biggest, most powerful car I've ever driven. Everyone's looking at me and I'm stalling it constantly as I'm driving down the high road. Eventually we got out, we got on some lovely, very fast motorways, and as I was bowling along and noticed that I'd exceeded the speed limit by a fairly decent margin, I just remember feeling the solidity of the car. The faster you go, the more solid it feels. And when you're going from quite a young guy driving standard small cars that you do into one of those, it's just absolutely unbelievable. I saw this car because I got a phone call from a friend of mine who knew the guy who was selling it, and he was moving to Canada and needed to sell the car. So the car was like 10 minutes from my office, so I walked down there that night, turned up in this kind of underground lit garage, and it was just sitting there looking kind of really mean and really cool. And we went for a drive. To be honest, before we even drove, I was going to buy the car. We ended up driving around to Sainsbury's car park. It was pouring with rain, and spinning the car and generally playing. And I had other Esprits before this one, so it just kind of felt good. And by the time I'd left, I'd literally given the guy the check and took the car a week later. But just as soon as I saw it, I just had to have it. The engine management's been changed to the Sport 300. It's the rear shocks and the front shocks have been changed to track shocks. The suspension's been reset to Sport 300 suspension. So that's very similar. It's just maybe a little bit sharper, fractionally more power. It's just to focus it a bit more. And when you combine the handling, the looks, the performance, the smoothness of the car, and just it's such a track-focused car, and that comes out when you're driving it. And I think that's really what sets it apart from pretty much any supercar in production at the moment. There's something very friendly about it. It's a very non-threatening car because it's an English brand. I think because of the connotations to F1, a lot of people remember them and have a lot of affection for them.
The 2.2 charge-cooled engine offered fantastic performance, but the buying public definitely needed more, which could probably only be achieved via a larger capacity engine. In 1996, the Esprit received the engine that many thought it deserved maybe 15 years earlier, in the shape of a V8 engine. Designed by Lotus themselves and producing 350 brake horsepower, the Esprit, at last, could be recognised as a true supercar.
Well, in fact, this is my first Lotus Esprit. I did have a Lotus before, which was a Lotus Excel Celebration, which was a limited edition model. I traded that in this year for a V8, having tried some of the four-cylinder cars, which were impressive. The V8 is again quite something in terms of the performance, and that's what really swayed me in favour of a V8, although it has to be said it's not such a cheap car to run. I'd always loved the shape of the Esprit, and I think particularly since Peter Stevens redesigned it back in the late 80s, to me personally that is a more attractive shape, and I think he did a very good job of it. I think as somebody who's obviously involved in sort of designing the Mclaren F1, then he can't be all bad. And it still turns heads now. It's a very nice, very distinctive car, still looks good, it hasn't dated, and it's something a bit different. I like to stand out from the crowd. Well, my car is a 96 registered, P-registered car, but it was originally registered and supplied, in fact, to one of the directors of Lotus. I think I chose the V8 really because I'd always wanted a V8 sports car of some kind. The appeal of the V8 is obviously because it does have that extra performance, although having had a go in one of the four-cylinder Esprits, which was an S4S, the performance was impressive, and the V8 is just in another league, and really it's as fast as anybody could reasonably want a road car to be. The 0 to 60 according to the Autocar test was 4.2 seconds, and 0 to 100 is 10.5. Top speed, which is largely an irrelevance these days anyway, is reckoned to be between 175 and 180. So that's enough to keep most people happy. And of course the advantage of it is that, like all Lotus, the handling is superbly sorted. It is a surprisingly comfortable and civilised car to drive, and although the steering is power assisted, it's very nicely weighted, so you have the right amount of feel, and you really would be hard pressed to know that it is power assisted, unless of course you're driving it around town or trying to manoeuvre into a parking space, when you obviously feel the benefits of that. When I bought the car, I did probably the best part exchange I could have hoped to have done on my Excel, and then paid cash for the balance. But it needed a few things doing on it, so it was quite reasonably priced, although all the history was there. And apart from having to have a new clutch in it, which was a fairly eye-watering bill shortly after I purchased it, most of the things I knew about and I budgeted for when I bought the car. The best things about the V8 are undoubtedly its handling and its performance. The ride quality is also very good for a car of its kind with such large wheels on it. The downside is, I'm afraid, the maintenance costs. Anybody who buys an Esprit V8 expecting it to be a cheap car to run is going to be in for a nasty surprise. It's not quite as horrendous as a contemporary Ferrari, and is marginally cheaper than a Porsche. But obviously you have a V8 engine with twin turbochargers, two very expensive catalysts to replace if they go wrong, and it's a lot of car to keep going and needs to be kept right up to spec with the maintenance. I think, along with a lot of people, my earliest memories of the Esprit go back to the James Bond days with the old style car. I can remember the first Esprit that I saw, which was an S1 of course, and was a bright red one, heading down the slip road onto the M2 shortly from where I lived with my parents at the time, and just being absolutely gobsmacked by it. It just looked such a wonderful shape. It was a real supercar, despite the fact it only had a 4-cylinder engine, and the performance of the early ones was very respectable in comparison to some of its contemporaries. And I think there was also a slight swell of pride in that it was British made, and had all that marvellous racing heritage behind it. And these were the things that sort of appealed to me as a boy, which I carried through as a man, in that the first real performance car I had was a Lotus, although I think there are many other marvellous marques and other cars that I wouldn't mind owning. Somehow I always seem to come back to Lotus. So I'm a one-make bore now, it's official. I think the history of the Esprit is one of sort of continuous evolution rather than revolution, aside from the reskin which it had back in the late 80s. And I think it's a car that can still hold its own against some of the best performance cars of today. Yeah, so the reaction to the car is interesting, I think overwhelmingly positive. People know enough about the Esprit, it's been around long enough to know what it is in most cases. I think that the fact that it's also British made means you tend to get a more positive response. I'm not sure whether it would be the same as a very bright colour, which is one of the reasons why I chose a darker one.
The Esprit is very much a hand-built car. It starts life as a galvanised steel backbone chassis with turrets at the front onto which the front suspension is mounted and a V-shape at the back into which the engine and gearbox are suspended. The first part of the build process is to attach the suspension, followed by the steering and the wheels, so in fact a rolling chassis is created. The rolling chassis is then ready to receive the in-house Lotus engine and the gearbox assembly before being removed to the final assembly area. Even at this very early stage, the vehicle will have an identity. The people that are building the car will know to which country the vehicle is to be supplied, so therefore is it to be built in left-hand drive or right-hand drive, what are the requirements for alarm systems, emission systems and so on. Having been completed to rolling chassis stage, the body, which would have been completed in another part of the Hethel facility, is made ready to lower onto the chassis. The body shell of the Lotus Esprit is of course made from reinforced glass fibre, which is lightweight. It's also very resilient in the event of an accident. I think it's fair to say that it's not just reinforced glass fibre, of course, because the whole body structure has to meet European and later on in life American federal standards of crashworthiness. The fitment of the body to the chassis is a relatively simple procedure of nuts and bolts. Upon completion of the fitment of the body to the rolling chassis, the whole vehicle is then moved on to the next part of the procedure, which involves the fitting of the doors, the bonnet, the tailgate, the interior trim, the glass, the instrumentation, and so on. Once the vehicle is finished, it will then pass to the final finishing area where it will be subject to some stringent tests, including of course a shakedown around the Hethel test track. I think the reason you buy any Lotus is for its fantastic ride and handling, a legacy from the Formula 1 days, the Colin Chapman days. Right until the end, the Esprit was winning awards for outstanding ride and handling capabilities, which I think even modern day cars will find difficult to surpass. In 1996, it was decided by Lotus that they should have just one model for the whole of Europe. Now, luxury taxes again caused a little bit of a problem in both Italy and in Greece, where vehicles of more than 2 litre capacity were taxed at a much higher rate. So with the GT3 it was decided that capacity would be reduced to 2 litres. Power also would be down a little bit, but to compensate for the slightly lesser power, the vehicle had a lot of the weight taken from it. So items such as full leather, air conditioning and the wing were relegated to the options list.
It's a GT3, I've had it 8 months now. It's 2 litre turbo basically, 0 to 60 about 4.9 seconds, will do 170 miles an hour. GT3 was actually brought out because people actually moaned at the price of Esprits at the time, and they were £50,000–60,000. The GT3, when it was actually produced, it was around 40,000, 37 to 40,000. It's actually the lightweight version, that's why it's still virtually the same speed. And there's a lot been taken off it, so it's just a clean lined car basically. We've got a full set of ground kit on the car, 4 neons. In a day like today they don't show up very well, but they usually give a nice glow at night, just to basically stand out at shows when I do shows. Fabulous car, great buy.
The V8 GT was a further attempt by Lotus to bring agility and nimbleness back to the Esprit. Some perhaps felt that with lots of leather and a wooden dashboard and so on, the Esprit had become more luxury than sporting.
The V8 GT came out in '98. It was marketed along with the SE. Basically Lotus split the V8 into 2 different models. The GT was a stripped out version with no wing, no air conditioning and very few options, and the SE basically came out with all the options. It gave Lotus a separate car to market, one at £50,000, one at £60,000.
This is a '98 V8 GT. It's the original Lotus press car, and I've owned it for just under a year. It's quite a historic car, having been featured in most of the magazines because it was the Lotus official launch car. And also, once they'd finished with it as the launch car, they then passed it on to a chap called Maximilian Cooper, who runs the Gumball Rally. And he then lent it to Jason Priestley, who drove it, I think, in '99, and he came 3rd. So it's quite a historic car. It's a very light car. The V8 is obviously the most powerful of the engines they've developed for the Esprit. The car itself is lightened. It doesn't have air conditioning, for example, so the car is very light and very well balanced. All of the Esprit range were very well balanced, but this is perhaps considered to be one of the most powerful, so it has the power and the balance. It's a beautiful car to drive. Because of its history, I've actually tried to keep it very standard. I've been tempted a couple of times to stick some extra modifications on the car, but at the end of the day, it is a historic car, and I'm trying to keep it as standard as I can because of that. Having said that, it does have the Sport 350 wheels on it, but that wasn't my decision. It was bought with those on it. So, like most people that grew up in the 70s and 80s, I'd always wanted one. We call it the Bond effect, and I was very lucky in that I came to a point where I could afford to get hold of one, and at the same time this one became available. I seized the opportunity.
The Sport 350 was introduced in 1999 in very small numbers, taking its inspiration from the GT1 race cars that were competing very successfully both in the UK and Europe. The car featured even bigger wheels and a race-derived rear wing as well as a unique interior.
The wheels that were put on were magnesium alloy, and they were the lightest wheels available for a production car. The interior was decked out with some carbon fibre, proper carbon fibre, and it had a wing on the back made from carbon fibre as well, which is basically a GT style wing.
The car behind me started life as a Sport 350, which is a limited edition. I was very happy with the car, but I have a background of modifying cars, and I started to consider what modifications could be done to the Esprit. And I came across some details for Mike Haynes, who I then found out was racing one of the original GT1 chassis. I contacted him and started a project, if you like. The project was conceived with the idea of creating a road-going replica of the race car based on the Sport 350. Originally the project was only supposed to take about 3 months, and the scope was fairly narrow, but as with all good projects, the scope ballooned and it took about 18 months to get to the state where it is now. And it's pretty much finished. The Sport 350 car was always created with the view of being a track car, and this project is also geared along the same lines. I would like to use the car on private track days, and the spec that it has is very much in line with that. It has the same wheels as the race car, it has very much the same brakes as the race car, similar spec, same suspension. The only real difference is the fact that it's based on a road car in the first instance instead of a purpose-built race car. We decided that we would put twin charge coolers on the engine so that we could increase the horsepower, and it also makes it more reliable when it's being pushed hard for track days. The car creates about 430 horsepower, which is 80 horsepower more than the standard car. But the car also has a lot of lightweight components shared with the racer, so there's a lot of carbon fibre components or honeycomb components, and that in conjunction with the extra horsepower means it's very performant as a package. The top speed is limited by the gearing of the transmission, so I think the Lotus specification is 175. I've never seen 175 in the car, I hasten to say. The 0 to 60, I haven't measured it. In fact, I've only driven the car 3 times since the project started off. But on the basis that it's lost a lot of weight and gained some healthy horsepower, I would say it's maybe sub 4 seconds to 60 and sub 9 seconds to 100. But that's just an estimate. It's a very extreme-looking road car, certainly more extreme than most supercars you see. Some people recognise the mark because of the wedge shape. Some people even have the enthusiasm to ask the question, what is it, or where did it come from? So it's an interesting part of the ownership.
2002 saw the final incarnation of the Lotus Esprit with an external redesign by Russell Carr, head of design at Lotus.
There wasn't a huge amount of changes made to it. There was new wheels put on, and the rear lights were changed. Basically, the Toyota part was unavailable, so Lotus had to redesign the rear of it. So they made a big feature of it as the sort of a Ferrari-like and a bit like the Elise. It was given slightly different seats, an alloy handbrake cover, some sills, just tarted up a little bit for the last few.
This car's a Lotus Spree V8. It's a special anniversary edition. It has various changes over the standard Esprit, which is mainly the round rear lights. This car was unique in a couple of ways. A, because it was the anniversary model and as such had not been seen on the road before, and B, because the particular colour scheme that it has had also not been seen on an Esprit. It was only available on the new Elise models. So I'd taken a bit of a gamble in choosing the colour, but I think it worked out well, and it certainly generated interest for other TV appearances as well. The wheels on this particular Esprit are actually not the intended wheels. Because the car was one of the first off the line, the wheels that should have been on it had not actually been delivered to Lotus. So it was either delay delivery or do something else. Lotus offered me a set of Sport 350 wheels, which I obviously accepted. This Esprit V8 has exactly the same engine as previous V8s. It generates 350 brake horsepower. Additional features on this particular model: it has uprated brakes, and a lot of extras fitted to the vehicle which would not normally be on a standard V8. It's very nice to drive on a daily basis. I actually use the car all year round. I tend to find that when the roads are wet you cannot put your foot down full to the boards for obvious reasons, but in general it's a very nice daily drive, but also the power is there if the roads are nice and dry and you need to open the throttle a bit. My first experience with the Esprit, I think, is like many other people of my age group, in that they were first seen on the James Bond films, and really from that day on there's always been a desire to own this particular type of car. I was fortunate enough that 5 years ago I was able to finally go out and purchase my first Esprit, and the love has continued from there on. This is one of the last Esprits off the production line, and in fact production has now ceased of the Esprit over a 30-year period. It's a shame to see it go. It's a car that still stands out in a crowd today, and it still represents a modern supercar. Hopefully Lotus will come up with a new design for a new Esprit, but we'll have to wait and see.
Obviously it was a very sad day when the final Esprit was produced. I've been associated with the Esprit for many, many years now, and many very happy memories of it.
It will be interesting to see how if they develop another Esprit in the future.
I think it's very sad that they're discontinuing the Esprit, but I'm hopeful that with Lotus's sort of engineering background, they'll produce more cars along the lines of the Esprit in the future.
We have an assurance that the Esprit name will be seen again in some other form in the not too distant future.
Just that one shot of it rolling off on the Bond movie that's the car I want, and that's just been fixed from then onwards. And I think that's what made the car. You've got so many people who grew up with those Bond movies, who saw that car for the first time. It's just such a pure shape. It's just a perfect car.
The Esprit's always had, even from the very, very earliest cars right through to the last one, there's always been a strong family resemblance. So they've updated them massively. They've always maintained that great wedge shape. You can see from the oldest to the newest Esprit that they are, very much a related car.
I sincerely do hope that the Lotus Esprit will be remembered in history as a British supercar, not only in feature films, not only in print, not only on TV and commercials, because it is one of a dying breed.
It really is a British icon. It is a supercar, one of the very few cars that has lasted 25 years, sort of a quarter of the automobile's history. It's made its mark.
I think I'd probably sum up the Esprit as it's an incredibly complete car. The looks are just so dramatic, they're so stunning. Even when it's stationary by the side of the road, it looks like it's moving. It's aggressive, but it's not overly so. Equally, the performance, the handling, all of it is just so complete, so precise. And I think really that's probably the summation of the Esprit. It's very much the perfect machine to do the task that it's made to do.
Well, I think even from the first incarnations of the Esprit, it's always had its familiar wedge shape, if you like. And I think from the notoriety that came from the Bond movies, people will always remember the wedge shape of the car.
It's going to be missed. It's really going to be missed, but the older ones are going to pass down through owners, and people are not going to want to get rid of them because they are such a phenomenal car to drive.
The mid-engine supercar really is something that seems to be slipping into the past, and I think the Esprit is one of the purest, most focused of the mid-engine supercars.
from a ride and handling point of view, the Esprit is still world renowned, and by way of frequent sort of updating and refreshing, the shape today still looks as good as it did back in 1972 when it was first seen at Turin.
How will the Esprit be remembered? I would say it's an icon.
Chapman's greatest road car.
As the Bond car.
The typically modern British supercar.
A British supercar.
It's just a legend.
Britain's version of the Ferrari.
It's a classic supercar shape.
A fantastic piece of British engineering, a real achievement.